Welcome to a journey into one of the darkest and most unsettling cases ever to emerge from Appalachian history. Today, we'll explore the chilling events that unfolded deep within the misty mountains of West Virginia, where three brothers left behind a legacy of terror that still lingers in the echoes of those valleys. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. This story will strike a chord with anyone familiar with the eerie silence of the mountains. It was the year 1872. Only 7 years after the Civil War had ended. West Virginia, still a newly formed state split from Virginia during the conflict, was a rugged land full of secrets buried in its forested hills. Communities were small and secluded, cut off by miles of dense woodland and rough paths that could barely be called roads. Law and order were distant concepts, something people read about in newspapers from the cities, but rarely experienced in these remote highlands. In Pocahontas County, where the mountains loomed like sleeping giants and fog clung stubbornly to the pine trees, lived the Hartley family. The father, Josiah Hartley, a former Confederate soldier, returned from war bearing deeper emotional wounds than physical ones. His wife, Rebecca, was a quiet woman who had learned early that silence was the safest way to survive. And then there were their sons, triplets born on a stormy night in May 1854, Samuel, Elias, and Noah. From childhood, the three were inseparable in a way that unsettled their neighbors. It wasn't merely that they were triplets, a rare enough sight to stir curiosity. It was how they communicated without words, how they always seemed to share a single thought. Locals whispered that the boys shared one soul divided into 3 bodies. Perhaps that eerie bond was what made them so dangerous. The Hartley home sat at the end of a winding dirt road that climbed through icy streams and thick woods where sunlight struggled to break through. The house itself was dark and weathered, with a barn behind it and acres of land that yielded little more than corn and a few vegetables. Josiah did his best to keep the farm afloat, but everyone knew the family's real survival came from hunting and trading, activities no one dared question. When the triplets turned 18 in May of 1872, something in the air shifted. Or maybe what had always been hidden finally came into view. Not long after, travelers began disappearing along the mountain trails. It wasn't a busy route, but the number of vanishings was enough to spread fear among traders who journeyed between small mountain towns. The first recorded case was that of a traveling salesman named Theodore Walsh, a middle-aged man who sold fabrics, tools, and stories from town to town. He was last seen in Greenbank, a quiet settlement about 15 miles from the Hartley property. He told the local tavern keeper he planned to take a shortcut through the mountains. A faster route, but one few dared use due to its rough terrain. Theodore never reached his destination. 3 weeks later, his wagon was discovered abandoned in a clearing. The horses were still harnessed, weak and terrified. But there were no signs of a struggle. His goods were gone, and there was no blood. It was as if Theodore had vanished into the mountain air. Sheriff William Garrett ruled it an accident or perhaps an animal attack, though no evidence supported either theory. 2 months later, in July of that same year, another traveler disappeared, a young preacher named Marcus Brennan. He had been spreading sermons about redemption in Marlington and had gathered a decent sum in donations to build a small church somewhere in the hills. Ignoring warnings from locals, Marcus took the same mountain trail. He too vanished. Weeks later, a hunter found his torn, mud-stained Bible near a creek just 2 miles from the Hartley homestead. The money was gone. Sheriff Garrett began to see a disturbing pattern. All the disappearances occurred within the same area, all involved lone travelers, and all took place along isolated paths. But investigating crimes in the Appalachians was no easy task. There were no telegraphs, no proper roads, and no manpower. Just 2 deputies to cover miles of wild, unforgiving terrain. And besides, the mountains had their own code. You didn't pry into others' affairs, especially not those of people known to be dangerous. The Hartleys weren't exactly welcomed by the community, yet they weren't openly shunned either. People simply kept their distance. Josiah would ride into town every few weeks to sell furs and buy supplies, speaking little and always paying with coins of unknown origin. The triplets rarely appeared in public, preferring the shadows of their secluded home. But in August of that year, something unusual happened. For the first time in months, Samuel, Elias, and Noah rode into town together. They arrived on strong horses, dressed in clothes that seemed far too fine for sons of a struggling farmer. They entered the Greenbank Tavern, ordered whiskey and sat silently in a corner, observing everyone who came and went. Henry Moss, the tavern owner, later told the sheriff that the brothers hardly spoke a word to each other, but seemed to communicate through glances and subtle gestures. He noticed, too, that each carried a gleaming hunting knife at his belt. Not unusual for mountain men, but the way they were positioned, always within easy reach, sent a chill down his spine. Henry poured their drinks without question and felt relief only when they left, leaving behind silver coins on the counter. That same night, a cattle dealer named Robert Finch stopped by the tavern. He had just sold a herd and was carrying a large sum of money, planning to head out at dawn using the same mountain trail near the Hartley property. Henry tried to persuade him to wait a day or take a safer route, but Robert was confident, too confident. He was a big, strong man who didn't believe in ghost stories or mountain superstitions. At sunrise, he set off alone, his wagon loaded and his earnings tucked beneath the seat. The trail climbed higher through narrow ravines where pine trees blocked out the daylight, leaving the world in a dim, eerie twilight. The only sounds were the creak of his wagon wheels and the occasional distant call of a bird. What Robert didn't know was that he was not alone. The Hartley Triplets knew every inch of that mountain, and they were watching. They had spent their childhood roaming those woods, mastering every cave, every deer path, and every hidden shortcut that branched from the main trails. They knew precisely where the road narrowed, where travelers would have to slow down, and where no one would be around to witness anything. They also knew how to move in complete silence, slipping through the forest like ghosts. 3 shadows acting as one. Robert Finch never made it to his destination. 5 days later, a group of lumberjacks found his wagon overturned in a shallow ravine off the main road. The horses had been released and vanished into the wild. The money he carried was missing, but what was most unsettling was that Robert himself had disappeared. There was no body, no blood, no clue. Just emptiness, as though the mountains had swallowed him whole. By then, Sheriff Garrett knew he could no longer ignore what was happening. The disappearances had become too frequent, and the merchants were beginning to avoid the route entirely, damaging trade throughout the region. In September 1872, Garrett gathered his 2 deputies and decided to pay the Hartley property a visit. He had no hard proof, only the sharp instincts that came from years of policing the Appalachian frontier. The journey took most of the morning. The trail twisted steeply upward, and the higher they went, the more suffocating the forest became. Autumn had just begun, painting the leaves red and gold, but the beauty of the season only deepened their unease. The young deputies exchanged anxious glances as they followed their sheriff deeper into the mountains. When the Hartley homestead finally came into view, the sun was already high, yet the property remained drenched in a peculiar darkness as though sunlight itself refused to touch it. The house, a tall, weather-beaten wooden structure, seemed to rise from the ground like part of the mountain, surrounded by gnarled trees and thick silence. No animals moved, no children laughed, just stillness dense and deliberate. Josiah Hartley stepped out before they could even dismount. Tall, gaunt, and hollow-eyed, he bore the haunted look of a man who had seen too much war. He didn't greet them or smile, only stood on the porch, waiting for the sheriff to speak. Behind him, framed by the doorway's shadow, stood the triplets, Samuel, Elias, and Noah. Nearly indistinguishable from one another, they stared with cold, reflective eyes that seemed almost inhuman. Sheriff Garrett explained his purpose: the disappearances, the townspeople's fear, and the need to ask questions. Josiah listened in silence before replying that his family knew nothing, rarely saw travelers, and minded their own business. The triplets remained behind him, motionless, 3 identical figures carved from flesh and suspicion. Garrett wasn't easily shaken, but the unnerving quiet and synchronized presence of the brothers made his instincts flare. He asked permission to search the property, a brief inspection just to clear doubts. Josiah hesitated, calculating the consequences of refusal, then finally nodded. The triplets would accompany them, however, every step of the way. The property turned out to be larger than expected. Beyond the main house and barn were several small sheds, some almost hidden by trees. As the sheriff and his men walked the grounds, Samuel, Elias, and Noah trailed exactly 10 paces behind, never separating, always watching. It felt, one deputy later recalled, like being stalked by wolves. Wolves that knew when to strike but chose patience instead. Inside the barn they found stacks of animal hides, tanning tools, and hunting gear, nothing unusual for a mountain family. In another shed were saddles, harnesses, and crates filled with common goods. When Garrett asked to inspect the boxes, Samuel complied, opening them one by one, revealing only hunting equipment and household items. But when they reached the third shed, the one farthest from the house, the sheriff noticed something different. A new, heavy padlock secured the door, far stronger than needed for ordinary supplies. When Garrett inquired about it, Elias was the first to respond, his voice low and rough from Dessous. He claimed it was just a storeroom for winter provisions that needed extra protection from wild animals. Noah stepped forward, produced a key, and unlocked the padlock with slow, deliberate movements. The door creaked open, revealing a cold, dim space filled with barrels of salted meat, grain sacks, candles, and soap. Everything appeared ordinary. The sheriff searched carefully, scanning every corner for anything linking the family to the missing men, but found nothing. No personal items, no trace of violence, no evidence of wrongdoing. What Garrett couldn't have known was that the triplets had already purged the property of all incriminating items. Days before, they had buried evidence deep in the forest, burned clothes, and destroyed every object that could tie them to their crimes. With no proof and no legal grounds for arrest, Garrett and his men finally mounted their horses and left. Yet as they descended the mountain, the sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong about that place. The triplets were too calm, too deliberate, too in sync, but suspicion alone wasn't enough. He needed solid evidence. As autumn wore on, the disappearances ceased. November and December passed quietly, and some began to believe the earlier events were simply tragic accidents, that the mountains had claimed careless travelers. Garrett wasn't convinced, but with no new victims, he could only stay alert and wait. The winter of 1872 to 1873 was one of the harshest Appalachia had seen. Snow began in mid-December and blanketed the land until March. Trails were impassable, and isolated families retreated into their homes, living off stored food and firewood, waiting for spring to return. At the Hartley farm, life appeared routine, but something darker brewed behind closed doors. While Josiah and Rebecca tended the animals and kept the house warm, the triplets spent long hours in the barn. By the faint glow of lanterns, they whispered plans, drew crude maps of the mountain trails, marked ambush points, and plotted escape routes. They didn't need many words, a glance or gesture was enough. They understood each other perfectly. The sheriff's visit, they knew, hadn't ended the danger. It had only confirmed it. It was a warning. They knew they had to be more cautious now, smarter, more deliberate. But stopping was never an option. Something deeper than greed drove them, something that had taken root over the years. It wasn't just about money or possessions anymore. It was about power. The intoxicating thrill of control, the rush of watching fear take hold in a victim's eyes, and the satisfaction of knowing they had fooled the entire community yet again. That was what kept them going. When spring finally arrived in April 1873, the mountain trails thawed, and travelers began to return. Commerce picked up, wagons moved between towns once more, and with that, the Hartley triplets resumed their grim work. This time, however, their methods were sharper, their planning flawless. They had learned from the sheriff's visit. There would be no oversights, no evidence left behind. The first disappearance of the new season came in May. Jonathan Pierce, a lawyer from Louisburg, set out to meet clients in a remote mountain settlement. He was a careful man, one who always sent word to his wife Elizabeth, detailing his travel plans and expected return. So when he failed to come home, she acted quickly, alerting the authorities in Louisburg, who in turn sent word to Sheriff Garrett in Pocahontas County. 2 days later, a wary messenger arrived at the sheriff's office, carrying a letter from Mrs. Pierce. It was a detailed account the route her husband intended to take, the documents he carried, even the clothes he'd worn the morning he left. Garrett rarely received such precise information and knew he needed to move fast. This time, he organized a proper search party, 8 men in total, including his 2 deputies and 6 volunteers from nearby settlements. They left at dawn, tracing Jonathan Pierce's route. The trail led directly through the same mountains where other travelers had vanished, cutting dangerously close to the Hartley property. As they rode, Garrett felt a tightening in his chest, a grim certainty that the truth awaited them in those woods. It was one of the men, Daniel Cooper, an experienced tracker, who first noticed something odd. At a sharp bend where the trees closed overhead like an archway, the earth bore the marks of wagon wheels veering off the main path. The ruts descended a gentle slope and vanished into thick undergrowth. Cooper called the others, and they dismounted, following the faint tracks into the forest. There, hidden beneath branches and brush, they found Pierce's wagon. It had been deliberately concealed. The horse was gone, the compartments rifled through, everything of value taken. Mud smeared the seats, as though someone had climbed in with dirty boots to rummage through the contents. But of Jonathan Pierce himself, there was no sign. Garrett ordered a wide search. The men fanned out in circles around the clearing, combing the woods, peering into ravines, checking under fallen logs. Hours passed, but they found nothing. No tracks, no blood, no trace of struggle. It was as though Pierce had been erased from existence, leaving behind only his empty wagon as a mocking reminder. What they didn't realize was that they were being watched. High above, from a rocky ridge nearly a quarter-mile away, the triplets observed every move. They had seen the search party ride through that morning and had climbed to their hidden lookout, a place that gave them a sweeping view of the valley while keeping them invisible. Samuel, using a pair of battered binoculars taken from a traveler years before, studied each man methodically. Elias and Noah crouched beside him motionless, controlling even their breathing to keep from making a sound. They had learned this skill from years of hunting deer, how to blend into the landscape so perfectly that they became part of it. And now they used it to hunt, and to survive being hunted. When the sun began to dip and the search party finally retreated down the trail, the triplets waited until the forest swallowed the last echo of hooves before moving. Then, with the same eerie coordination that bound them together, they descended the rocky slope and vanished into the woods. By the time darkness fell, they had already slipped back into the shadows of their home, entering through the rear door as silently as wraiths. Inside, Josiah sat at the kitchen table, a dim oil lamp casting flickering light across his gaunt features. He looked up as his sons entered, his expression unreadable, a mix of exhaustion, quiet acceptance, and perhaps a trace of guilt. Rebecca moved mechanically at the stove, her hands busy preparing supper, her eyes fixed forward, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. That night, when the house grew silent and the others slept, Samuel crept down to the basement. The space was cold and damp, its stone walls sweating with moisture. In the farthest corner, beneath old planks and burlap sacks, was a concealed trapdoor leading to a deeper chamber, a natural cavern discovered when the Hartleys first built the house. It was here that the brothers kept their darkest secrets. Samuel lit a lantern and descended the rough wooden steps. The cave was larger than one would expect, tall enough to stand upright. Along its rocky walls were neat rows of the victims' belongings, clothes folded, leather satchels lined up, pocket watches and wallets arranged like relics. Every item catalogued, preserved, and displayed with unsettling care, trophies of their twisted victories. At the center stood a crude table made of rough boards, cluttered with hand-drawn maps, coded notes only the brothers could decipher, and carefully stacked piles of coins and bills. Samuel inspected everything methodically, ensuring no incriminating trace had been left above ground in case another search came. Satisfied, he extinguished the lantern and climbed back up, closing the trapdoor behind him. In the days that followed, Sheriff Garrett launched 3 more searches, each broader than the last. He even brought in bloodhounds from a neighboring county, hoping the dogs might catch a scent. But every time they seemed to find a trail, it abruptly vanished, usually near a creek or over rocky terrain. It was as if whoever had taken Jonathan Pierce knew exactly how to throw them off. Desperate for answers, Elizabeth Pierce posted a 200 reward, a small fortune for mountain folk. Posters with Jonathan's description appeared in taverns and meeting halls across the county, but no one came forward. The mountains stayed silent, their secrets buried beneath snow and stone. Still, the reward stirred something unexpected. Instead of information about Jonathan, it brought old suspicions back to life. People who had kept quiet began to whisper. One woman recalled seeing the Hartley triplets selling an expensive saddle at a fair, too fine for boys from a struggling farm. A merchant mentioned buying nearly new tools from them, strange for men who supposedly lived hand to mouth in the wild. Piece by piece, Sheriff Garrett began to see a disturbing pattern forming. Not evidence he could take to court, but a mosaic of unease. And every fragment pointed in the same direction: the Hartley brothers. Every time someone vanished, it seemed the Hartleys soon surfaced in town with newfound wealth or valuable goods to sell. It was never anything that directly tied them to the missing. Nothing so blatant as a man's watch or a woman's ring. But always enough to suggest a subtle rise in fortune. Their timing was too precise to be coincidence, their restraint too deliberate to be luck. It was cunning, methodical, and maddeningly difficult to prove. By June of 1873, Sheriff Garrett decided to take a bold risk. He persuaded a merchant named Thomas Whitmore, a brave and reliable man, to act as bait. Thomas would pose as a solitary traveler moving through the treacherous trail, his wagon filled with counterfeit goods and false currency. Hidden behind him, about half a mile back, Garrett and 3 deputies would follow silently, ready to intervene. The goal was simple yet perilous: to catch the perpetrators in the very act. On a bright June morning, Thomas set out, the wheels of his wagon creaking as he ascended the winding mountain road. He whistled and hummed occasionally, just as Garrett had instructed, giving every impression of a man blissfully unaware of danger. Behind him, the sheriff and his men advanced cautiously, halting often to ensure they weren't spotted. Everything unfolded perfectly, almost too perfectly. When Thomas reached a particularly remote stretch where the trees grew thick and visibility narrowed, 3 figures stepped from the forest shadows, the triplets. They moved in perfect synchronization. Samuel blocked the path ahead, while Elias and Noah emerged from both sides, cutting off any hope of escape. Feigning surprise, Thomas tugged on the reins, halting the horse. Samuel approached, a knife glinting in his hand, his voice disturbingly calm as he ordered Thomas to step down from the wagon, more like a polite request than a threat. His brothers stood guard on either flank, their daggers catching slivers of filtered sunlight through the leaves. Then came the sound that shattered the stillness. Garrett's voice, commanding and sharp, as he and his deputies appeared with weapons drawn. They shouted for the triplets to drop their knives and raise their hands. For a long, suspended moment, time seemed to stop. The 3 brothers didn't flinch, didn't panic. Instead, a look of cold calculation passed among them, as if they were wordlessly measuring their chances. Finally, Samuel let his knife fall and slowly lifted his hands. Elias and Noah followed his lead an instant later, their movements eerily in sync even in defeat. The deputies closed in, handcuffs clinking in the heavy silence. The brothers offered no resistance, no curses or protests, only that unsettling calm, their stillness more unnerving than any violent outburst. The capture of the Hartley triplets sent shockwaves through the region. Word spread swiftly from town to town, growing more dramatic with each retelling. Communities that had lived in fear for years finally had a name and faces to match their nightmares. Relatives of the missing flooded into the county, seeking closure, demanding answers. The trial was set for August, allowing time for the district attorney to gather witnesses and evidence. Garrett knew, however, that catching them in the act was only the beginning. To secure a conviction, he needed irrefutable proof linking the Hartleys to the long list of disappearances. Armed with a proper warrant, Garrett returned to the Hartley property with a 10-man team. Josiah and Rebecca were kept under guard inside the house while the men scoured every inch of the farm, the barn, the fields, the sheds. Yet the brothers had been meticulous. Nothing obvious, nothing traceable. Then a young deputy, Michael Hayes, noticed something peculiar in the basement, a patch of dirt that seemed recently disturbed. When they began digging, their shovels struck wood, a concealed trapdoor buried under inches of loose soil. Garrett's pulse quickened as they pried it open, revealing a narrow stairway descending into darkness. Lantern in hand, Garrett led the descent. The air grew colder, heavier, thick with the smell of damp earth and something faintly metallic that turned the stomach. Each creaking step echoed against the stone until the cave opened before them. What they found froze them in place. The walls were lined with crude shelves, each stacked with neatly arranged possessions. Clothing, satchels, leather cases engraved with initials, pocket watches still ticking faintly, as though time itself had refused to move on. It was a grotesque gallery of lives stolen and displayed. On a wooden table lay notebooks filled with meticulous records, lists of names, dates, and notes describing each attack in chilling detail. The triplets had documented everything, the routes taken, how each victim was approached, even how they disposed of evidence. Among the collection, Garrett recognized several items immediately: the Bible belonging to Marcus Brennan, the missing preacher, a wallet embossed with the initials of Theodore Walsh. One of the earliest known victims, and most heartbreaking of all, the spectacles Elizabeth Pierce had described in her letter. Etched into the cave walls were dozens of carved marks, a grim tally of lives taken. Garrett counted 43 in total. 43 people who had vanished without a trace, and in a dark corner, Deputy Paul Hicks discovered something even more disturbing: bundles of personal letters, family portraits, and diaries. The triplets hadn't just stolen lives, they had kept their victims' memories, studied them, preserved them with the same care as their trophies. It was more than greed, it was obsession, a cold, methodical cruelty that no sane mind could explain. Garrett ordered every item carefully catalogued and taken as evidence, his hands trembling as he realized the scale of the horror he had just uncovered. It took the search team 3 full days to clear out the cave, carefully logging, wrapping, and transporting each piece of evidence to a secure facility in the city. As the work continued, families from across the region began to arrive, many recognizing items that had once belonged to their missing loved ones. An elderly widow identified her late husband's pocket watch, gone since 1868. A grown man, his voice trembling, confirmed a carved walking cane that had belonged to his father, who'd vanished when he was still a child. The discovery completely transformed the case. What had once seemed a string of isolated disappearances was now exposed as something far larger. A long-running operation the triplets had likely begun even before reaching adulthood. Sheriff Garrett found himself wondering if Josiah and Rebecca Hartley truly had no knowledge of what their sons were doing, or if they had chosen to turn a blind eye out of fear or guilt. When he questioned Josiah, the old man seemed to shrink into himself, muttering that he knew nothing, that his sons kept their own affairs private, and he had long since learned not to ask questions. Rebecca said even less, her eyes red and swollen as she wept, insisting through sobs that she had raised her children to be good men and couldn't fathom how they had turned into monsters. Whether their ignorance was genuine or deliberate, no one could tell. Soon, the county prosecutor, Edward Simmons, arrived from Louisburg to take control of the investigation. Simmons was a careful, experienced man who understood the gravity of what lay before him. The triplets hadn't spoken a single word since their arrest, maintaining an eerie silence that unsettled even seasoned officers, but the cave itself spoke volumes. Simmons spent weeks interviewing witnesses and gathering sworn statements from merchants who had done business with the Hartleys, as well as from neighbors who recalled unusual behavior over the years. Piece by piece, he constructed a timeline linking every known disappearance to the periods when the brothers had appeared in town with fresh money or new goods to sell. The pattern was too consistent to dismiss, even without confessions. The defense was assigned to a court-appointed attorney, a young and nervous man named Richard Caldwell. Lacking experience, he argued that the case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence, that possession of stolen items did not necessarily prove murder. Perhaps, he suggested weakly, the brothers had merely found the belongings abandoned along the trails, scavengers rather than killers. It was a flimsy argument, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. What disturbed Simmons most, however, was the brothers' complete lack of emotion. During the hearings, Samuel, Elias, and Noah sat side by side, 3 identical faces staring blankly ahead, showing neither fear nor regret. They appeared detached, as though the trial were nothing more than a play being performed for others' amusement. By midsummer, anticipation for the upcoming trial consumed the entire county. It was to be the largest and most publicized event in Pocahontas County's history. The small courthouse couldn't hold the crowd, so officials decided to move the proceedings to the Methodist Church's community hall, the only space large enough for the jury, witnesses, and the restless public demanding entry. Families of victims came from neighboring states, many traveling for days through the mountains, just to see the men who had haunted their lives. A woman from Kentucky arrived in search of her brother, who'd vanished 6 years earlier, an elderly couple from Pennsylvania, came hoping for word of their only son, missing since 1869. Each carried their own fragment of grief, now converging in one unbearable moment of reckoning. Simmons knew his greatest challenge wasn't merely proving guilt. It was presenting the evidence in a way that a rural jury of farmers and merchants could fully comprehend. He needed to transform the cave's collection of artifacts into a story so clear and undeniable that it would leave no room for doubt. The trial began during the first week of August, under suffocating heat that seemed to mirror the tension in the air. The hall was packed beyond capacity. People stood shoulder to shoulder, others pressed against the open windows trying to listen. The triplets were brought in under heavy guard, wrists and ankles shackled, yet still eerily composed. Presiding Judge Harold Blackwood, a stern and disciplined man, opened the proceedings by reminding the jury to weigh only the evidence and not be swayed by rumors or emotion. But it was impossible to ignore the charged atmosphere. The stares of grieving families fixed on the accused, the whispers of outrage moving through the crowd. Simmons began his opening statement by recounting the discovery of the cave. He called to the stand the men who had been there during the search. Deputy Michael Hayes described finding the hidden trapdoor and the chillingly organized contents below. The shelves, the notebooks, the trophies. Then came the physical evidence. One by one, items were presented to the jury. Marcus Brennan's Bible, instantly recognized by his widow. Theodore Walsh's engraved pocket watch, confirmed by his brother. Jonathan Pierce's eyeglasses, matched to the exact prescription described by his wife, Elizabeth. Witness after witness took the stand. A merchant identified his missing business partner's leather wallet. An elderly mother broke down when shown the silver brooch that had belonged to her daughter. A young teacher lost on her way to a remote school. Each piece of evidence added another layer to the mountain of proof Simmons was building. Next came testimony from townsfolk and merchants. Henry Moss, who owned the local tavern, swore that the Hartley brothers had appeared there one August night, freshly dressed and freely spending money, just hours before a traveler named Robert Finch vanished. A blacksmith recounted purchasing nearly new tools from them, tools later traced to another missing man. Others described strange encounters. A hunter recalled spotting the triplets deep in the woods, always together, always watching. A woman living alone near the foothills told of hearing distant screams echoing through the mountains at night, though she had never dared investigate. Through it all, the brothers remained utterly motionless. They didn't flinch when personal belongings were shown, nor did they react to the tears of those testifying. Occasionally they exchanged brief, silent glances, communicating in a way only they seemed to understand. But otherwise they were as expressionless as statues. Richard Caldwell did what he could, cross-examining witnesses, suggesting mistaken identities or coincidences, but his defense was fragile and unconvincing. Even he seemed to realize he was merely going through the motions, trapped in a hopeless battle against overwhelming evidence. On the 5th day of the trial, Prosecutor Simmons unveiled what he believed to be his most damning evidence yet: the notebooks. He mentioned something about the hollow under the oak, words that immediately caught the guard's attention. When the statement reached Prosecutor Simmons, he ordered a team to investigate the area Noah had referenced. The following morning, a group of deputies and volunteers searched the old oak grove several miles from the Hartley property. What they discovered there sent shockwaves through the entire county. A shallow pit covered with branches and leaves, containing the skeletal remains of at least 3 individuals. Nearby, fragments of clothing, jewelry, and personal effects matched descriptions from several unsolved disappearance cases. The discovery reinforced every accusation made against the triplets, cementing in the public's mind that there could be no mistake about their guilt. When the trial resumed, Simmons introduced the new findings as supplemental evidence. The courtroom fell completely silent as photographs and detailed sketches of the pit were presented. The defense objected, claiming the evidence was circumstantial and improperly obtained, but Judge Blackwood allowed it, ruling that its relevance outweighed procedural concerns. The atmosphere grew even heavier. Every new revelation seemed to strip away the last remnants of doubt. The jury, already uneasy, now stared at the 3 brothers with open disgust. The townspeople murmured prayers or wept quietly. The families of the victims could no longer contain their grief. Many had waited years for answers, and though justice was near, it came with unbearable pain. Throughout it all, the triplets remained eerily calm. Even as evidence mounted, their expressions didn't falter. They sat side by side like mirror reflections, occasionally exchanging brief glances, as if communicating silently. To many, that composure was more chilling than any confession could have been. Simmons, in his closing statement, painted them as predators who had perfected their cruelty over years, turning the wilderness into a place of terror. He spoke not just of murder, but of deliberate planning, an ongoing enterprise driven by control and calculation. They did not act in rage, he told the jury, but in precision. Caldwell, exhausted and pale, delivered his final defense with little conviction. He argued that no one had witnessed the crimes directly, that the supposed notebooks might have been misinterpreted, and that coincidence could not be entirely dismissed. But his words lacked weight against the overwhelming tide of evidence. Even he seemed to understand that his client's fate was already sealed. When the jury retired to deliberate, the tension in the hall was unbearable. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the rustle of people shifting uncomfortably on wooden benches. Finally, as night fell, the jurors returned. The foreman's voice was unsteady as he read the verdict, guilty on all counts. A collective gasp filled the hall, followed by sobs, prayers, and murmurs of relief. The triplets did not react. They remained motionless, their faces unreadable. Judge Blackwood sentenced Samuel, Elias, and Noah Hartley to death by hanging, to be carried out at sunrise 2 weeks later. The decision was met with both satisfaction and dread. Satisfaction that justice would finally be done, and dread at the thought of witnessing the end of something so monstrous yet human. In the days that followed, people traveled from across the state to see the condemned brothers, hoping perhaps to understand what had driven them to such darkness. But the triplets never spoke again. They spent their final days in silence, eating little, staring out of their cell windows toward the mountains that had once been their hunting ground. On the morning of the execution, the sky was overcast and the air still. The gallows had been erected on the edge of the courthouse yard. Hundreds gathered, their faces solemn. The Hartley brothers were brought out together, still calm, still united in silence. When asked for last words, none of them responded. The hangman did his duty swiftly. For a long moment after the trapdoors fell, no one in the crowd moved or spoke. It was as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. In the years that followed, the Hartley case became legend, a dark parable told in whispers by firelight. Some said the brothers' ghosts still roamed the old trails, searching for their victims. Others believed their silence had hidden truths no one ever uncovered. But to most, their story remained a reminder of how evil can grow quietly, hidden beneath the ordinary, until it consumes everything around it. In that instant, Samuel and Elias both turned sharply toward Noah, their eyes fixed on him with such piercing intensity that he immediately fell silent. The brief exchange drew attention, and the incident was quickly reported to the judge and attorneys. However, when questioned, Noah refused to repeat what he had said, or to speak at all. Later, the guard who had overheard the words, a straightforward man named Peter Sullivan, testified that it sounded like Noah had muttered. There were so many, though he couldn't swear to it with certainty. Prosecutor Simmons used the remark to suggest a crack in the brothers' composure and a possible sign of guilt, while the defense countered that vague, stress-induced mutterings meant nothing. Still, the episode marked the first visible fracture in the triplets' eerie unity. It was almost imperceptible, noticeable only to those who had been watching them closely, but it was undeniable. From that day onward, Samuel and Elias sat closer together during proceedings, while Noah's chair seemed subtly distanced. Their once synchronized glances now carried a faint tension, something restrained and uncertain. Simmons quickly recognized the shift and sought to exploit it. He petitioned Judge Blackwood to allow each brother to testify separately, believing isolation might unravel their pact of silence. Defense attorney Caldwell objected vehemently, accusing the prosecution of psychological manipulation and insisting such tactics violated the integrity of the trial. After careful consideration, Judge Blackwood denied the request, maintaining that the proceedings must adhere strictly to due process. As the trial entered its third week, Simmons introduced his final set of evidence, a compilation of financial and property records painstakingly assembled over several weeks. These documents revealed that the Hartleys possessed wealth far exceeding what their failing farm could ever generate. Records showed major purchases coinciding suspiciously with clusters of disappearances. In 1870, for instance, the triplets bought a thoroughbred horse just weeks after 3 travelers vanished. In the winter of 1871, they acquired a costly set of blacksmith tools, right after a craftsman had gone missing. A Charleston accountant was called to the stand to translate the figures into plain terms for the jury. Adjusting his spectacles, he explained that the family's expenditures simply didn't add up. Their lifestyle was impossible without a steady influx of illicit income that perfectly mirrored the timeline of the disappearances. Then Simmons made an unorthodox request. He asked permission to take the jury to the Hartley property itself, to stand where the crimes had unfolded. Though unconventional, Judge Blackwood granted the motion under strict supervision. The following morning, a somber procession of carriages and horseback riders made its way up the rugged trail to the Hartley estate, retracing the paths so many victims had once taken. The journey changed everything. When the jurors descended into the cave, the reality of the case hit with visceral force. The shelves, now empty, seemed to hum with ghosts, each gap representing a missing life. Sheriff Garrett guided the group, pointing out how the land's elevation and tree cover had offered perfect concealment for observation. From the rocky ledge overlooking the valley, the jurors could see for miles, the same vantage point the triplets had used to stalk travelers. It was a chilling revelation. The landscape itself had been their accomplice. At one juror's request, the group was allowed to step inside the Hartley house. It was spotless but lifeless, more a storage space than a home. There were no personal touches, no warmth, no signs of ordinary domestic life. The bedrooms of the triplets were particularly unnerving. 3 identical rooms, with neatly made beds, everything aligned with mechanical precision. The experience left the visitors shaken and wordless on the return trip. When court resumed, the jurors' demeanor had changed. Their faces reflected grim certainty. They had seen what words could only suggest. Caldwell knew the battle was over, but he still fulfilled his duty, arguing one final time that the evidence was circumstantial, that suspicion was not proof, and that reasonable doubt still existed. His words, though earnest, fell flat against the mountain of evidence. Simmons, in contrast, delivered his closing argument with measured passion. He spoke not of statistics or records, but of human lives, of Theodore Walsh, the devoted father of 4, of Marcus Brennan, who had dreamed of founding a mountain church, of Jonathan Pierce, whose wife, Elizabeth, still awaited closure. He pointed toward the triplets and described how they had turned the Appalachian wilderness into a hunting ground, their cave into a temple of cruelty. He painted them as methodical predators, proud enough of their acts to document them meticulously. Then, with a voice trembling with conviction, he urged the jury to remember not just the named victims, but the 43 tally marks carved into the cave's stone wall, each one a life extinguished without mercy. Judge Blackwood instructed the jury carefully, emphasizing their duty to weigh the evidence without emotion, to differentiate between rumor and proof, and to reach a unanimous verdict. He reminded them that their decision would not only determine the fate of the Hartley brothers, but would also define justice itself in their mountain community. Late that scorching August afternoon, the jury withdrew to deliberate. The hall fell into a tense hush. Families of the missing refused to leave, lingering in corridors and on benches. Some whispered prayers, others spoke softly of the loved ones they had lost. Elizabeth Pierce sat alone in the back, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes fixed on the jury door. In a nearby room, the triplets waited under heavy guard. Through the thin wooden walls, people claimed to hear faint voices, the brothers speaking for the first time in weeks. Though the words remained indecipherable, a low, rhythmic murmur, disturbingly in sync even as their fate hung in the balance. The jury deliberated for nearly 12 hours. As night fell over Pocahontas County, lamplight flickered through the windows of the hall, casting restless shadows of 12 men wrestling with the weight of history. No one in town slept that night. All awaited the verdict that would finally decide whether the mountains would at last have peace, or whether their darkness would endure. There was an unshakable heaviness in the air that night, a tension that seemed to freeze everyone in place. Elizabeth Pierce remained seated on her bench long after others had begun to drift away. When Sheriff Garrett quietly suggested she take some rest, she simply shook her head and replied that she had waited over a year for answers about Jonathan. A few more hours meant nothing. Her calm resolve became a quiet source of strength for the other families gathered there, a living reminder of why they had all come. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, the door to the jury deliberation room creaked open. William Preston, one of the jurors, stepped out and called for the attending officer. In a low voice, he announced that the jury had reached a unanimous decision. Word spread quickly through the drowsy town. Riders were sent to alert Judge Blackwood and both legal teams. Within an hour, the courthouse was crowded again, lanterns and torches flickering in tired hands, faces pale with exhaustion but burning with anticipation. At 3:30 a.m., the Hartley triplets were brought back into the hall. Despite the hour and the weight of what awaited them, their expressions remained eerily composed. Samuel, Elijah, and Noah sat side by side, their identical faces reflecting the same cold stillness that had followed them since the start of the trial. Whatever strain had existed between them earlier was gone. The threat of judgment had bound them together again, as though they shared a single will. When Judge Blackwood entered, the crowd rose to its feet. The silence that fell over the chamber was so deep that even the sound of breathing seemed intrusive. The judge summoned the jury, and the 12 men filed back into their seats, their grim expressions betraying the magnitude of their choice. None dared meet the defendant's eyes. That alone was enough for many in the audience to guess the outcome. Preston, as foreman, rose when called upon. Judge Blackwood asked whether the jury had reached a unanimous verdict. Preston nodded and confirmed they had. His voice was steady, though his hands shook faintly as he held the paper. Not from doubt, but from the burden of the words it carried. At the judge's command, the defendants stood in perfect synchrony, their movements mirrored as always. For the first time since the proceedings began, something shifted in their faces. Not fear, but a solemn acceptance. Samuel clasped his hands behind his back, and his brothers followed in unison, their lifelong pattern unbroken even now. Preston began to read. Guilty of highway robbery. Guilty of aggravated robbery. For 23 counts with stronger evidence, guilty of direct involvement in disappearances. Each word rang through the courtroom like a hammer strike. Guilty. Again and again. By the end, the word itself seemed to hang in the air, heavy and final. The reaction was immediate. Some broke down in tears, relief mingled with grief as long-awaited justice finally arrived. Others sat in silence, stunned by the reality that these 3 men, so young, so composed, had caused such devastation. Elizabeth Pierce buried her face in her hands, trembling with months of suppressed emotion. Somewhere in the back, a woman screamed and collapsed, caught by those nearby. Judge Blackwood slammed his gavel repeatedly, shouting for order. It took several long minutes for quiet to return. Through all of it, the triplets did not move. They stood like carved figures, watching the chaos unfold as though they were merely witnesses, not the condemned. Their lack of emotion unsettled everyone present. The sentencing was set for the following week, giving Prosecutor Simmons time to prepare his final recommendations and allowing Caldwell a last chance to argue for leniency. Though no one in the room believed mercy would be granted, in West Virginia in 1873, such crimes had only one possible outcome. The days that followed were filled with restless anticipation. Families of the victims lingered in town, many taken in by sympathetic locals. There was a shared sense that something momentous was unfolding, a story that would be told for generations in the mountains. Reporters poured in from neighboring states, crowding taverns and inns, scribbling notes for the newspapers that would soon carry the tale across the region. Rebecca Hartley appeared just once that week, visiting her sons in the temporary jail. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. When she emerged, her face was blank, her spirit seemingly hollowed out. She left town the same day, retreating to the family estate in the mountains, where she would spend the rest of her days in solitude. A mother who had lost all her children, not to fate, but to horror. Josiah Hartley never came to see his sons. He was spotted only once, riding down Main Street toward the hardware store, ignoring everyone who tried to speak to him. Rumors spread that he intended to sell the property and disappear once it was all over. No one would have blamed him. Inside the prison, The triplets reverted to silence. Guards reported they barely ate, slept little, and spent long stretches sitting together wordlessly. At times, faint murmurs could be heard from their cell, though no one could make out the words. It was said they had their own private language, one no outsider could understand. When sentencing day arrived, a cool September mist blanketed the town. The courthouse filled beyond capacity, the air thick with both dread and expectation. Judge Blackwood began by acknowledging the weight of the moment. He spoke of law and justice, of the duty to protect the innocent and condemn those who preyed upon others. He spoke of the mountains themselves, their beauty stained by crimes so terrible they had scarred the soul of the region. Caldwell made one final plea for mercy, citing the triplets' youth and the possibility of redemption, but his words fell flat in the cold silence that followed. There was no forgiveness left in that room. Then Simmons stood for the final time. He didn't need to speak for long. He walked to the front of the courtroom, met the triplets' eyes one by one, and prepared to deliver his last words. For the first time during the entire proceedings, Samuel, Elias, and Noah met the prosecutor's eyes directly, their cold, expressionless faces revealing nothing. The same unsettling emptiness that had haunted everyone throughout the trial was still there, unchanged. The prosecutor turned to Judge Blackwood and stated plainly that the enormity of the crimes, their clear premeditation, the utter absence of remorse, and the staggering number of destroyed lives demanded nothing less than the maximum penalty allowed by law. He referenced the 43 marks carved into the cave wall, each one a grim testament not only to a single victim, but to the families and communities left shattered in their wake. True justice, he argued, required a punishment proportionate to the horror of their deeds. Judge Blackwood then turned to the defendants and asked if they had anything to say before sentencing. Their final chance to speak, to show remorse, or to offer any explanation. The silence that followed stretched unbearably long. Every person in the courtroom held their breath, waiting to see if the brothers would finally break their eerie quiet. It was Samuel who finally rose. He looked slowly around the crowded hall, and in a steady, almost serene voice, he said, "The mountains have always taken their toll on those who cross them. We simply took ours." There was no apology, no regret, just a cold acknowledgement that froze the room. His words carried no plea, only conviction. Elijah and Noah said nothing, but the look in their eyes mirrored Samuel's chilling acceptance. In that moment, the truth of their guilt was undeniable, deliberate, unrepentant, and entirely without shame. Judge Blackwood waited for any further comment, but none came. Gathering his papers, he began to read the formal sentence. His tone was measured and authoritative, each word falling like a gavel strike. For every count of aggravated robbery and every proven disappearance, he imposed the maximum punishment. And finally, he pronounced the inevitable conclusion: Samuel, Elias, and Noah Hartley were to be executed by hanging. The sentence would be carried out in 3 weeks' time in the county jail yard, allowing for the completion of legal formalities and any last-minute appeals, though no one truly expected any. With a final strike of the gavel, the judgment was sealed. The room erupted. Some people applauded, overcome with relief that justice had at last been served. Others wept openly, struggling to process the end of such a grim chapter. Elizabeth Pierce remained seated, hands clasped tightly in her lap as silent tears streamed down her cheeks. She had sought answers for over a year, and now she had them, though no verdict could ever bring Jonathan back. The triplets were escorted out of the hall under heavy guard. For the first time, chains were fastened not only to their wrists and ankles, but also linking the three together. A precaution recognizing that even condemned, their unity made them dangerous. As they were marched through Main Street toward the prison, townspeople lined the sidewalks, watching in solemn silence. There were no shouts or curses, only the heavy quiet of a community witnessing the end of something monstrous. The next 3 weeks passed under a somber pall. Life continued in Pocahontas County, but the shadow of the coming execution loomed over everything. Each day, the gallows took shape in the prison yard, its frame of fresh pine rising until it stood as a grim monument visible from half the town. Parents kept their children away, but everyone knew what awaited. Reverend William Hughes, the town's pastor, visited the brothers frequently, still believing redemption was possible even in the final hours. He prayed with them, spoke of salvation, and tried to awaken any spark of conscience. Yet the triplets remained distant, listening politely but showing no emotion. When he left, the Reverend carried a deep sorrow, convinced he had failed to reach them. Caldwell filed an obligatory appeal, but it was swiftly denied. There were no procedural flaws, no overlooked evidence. The trial had been fair, the sentence lawful. The date remained unchanged. On the eve of their execution, the Hartley brothers were granted their final meal. They all chose the same dish: roast venison with potatoes and homemade bread. A simple meal from the mountains of their childhood. They ate together quietly in their shared cell. Later, the guards reported that the three lay down and seemed to sleep peacefully, more at ease than they had been in weeks. The morning of the execution dawned grey, with low clouds threatening rain. By early light, crowds had gathered outside the prison. Townsfolk, victims' families, and curious onlookers, all drawn by the gravity of the event. Sheriff Garrett established strict boundaries, allowing only official witnesses into the yard. Among them was Elizabeth Pierce, dressed once again in the mourning clothes she had worn throughout the trial. When a reporter asked why she had returned, she answered softly that Jonathan deserved someone who loved him to see justice carried out. At 10 o'clock, the triplets were led into the courtyard. Still bound together by their chains, they moved in synchronized steps, calm and composed. Their hair had been cut short, their clothes plain and institutional, but their faces remained unchanged, serene, detached, as if they were walking to another ordinary day. The gallows stood beneath the dim September sky, its new timber still carrying the scent of resin. 3 ropes hung from the crossbeam, swaying gently in the cold mountain breeze. The sight alone made even the hardest onlookers avert their eyes. The Hartley brothers took their places side by side beneath the scaffold, their formation unbroken to the end. The executioner, brought in from another county to ensure impartiality, inspected the ropes and knots carefully. His steady hands betrayed years of experience. He would make sure their deaths were quick, free of cruelty, even for men who had inflicted so much upon others. Reverend Hughes ascended the scaffold and offered a final prayer, his trembling voice breaking the tense silence. He spoke of divine mercy, of the chance for redemption even at the final threshold, reminding everyone that God alone saw what was hidden within the human heart. When he finished, he turned to the 3 condemned men and asked softly if they had any last words for the world they were leaving behind. The brothers exchanged one last look, that wordless communication passing between them as it always had. Then Elijah, who had spoken only rarely throughout his life, lifted his head and uttered words that would echo through Appalachian history for generations. "You call us monsters," he said, his voice calm and deliberate, "but we only did what the mountains have always done. We took from the weak, the unprepared, the alone. Nature knows no morality, only survival." Noah followed, his tone a solemn echo of his brothers. "We were 3 parts of one whole. We were born together, lived together, and now we die together. There is no regret in what we were." Samuel said nothing. His gaze swept the crowd unreadable, perhaps defiance, perhaps apathy, but not fear. Their calm, almost detached composure unsettled everyone present. Sheriff Garrett stepped forward to fulfill his final duty, reading the charges and the sentence aloud. His voice carried the full weight of months of investigation and the pain of the families he had come to know. When the last word was spoken, he gave the signal. Black hoods were drawn over the triplets' heads, erasing their faces from view. The executioner, silent, efficient, and expressionless, took his position at the lever. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind fell still. Then, with one firm motion, the lever was pulled. The trapdoors dropped open, and the ropes snapped taut with a creak that echoed across the courtyard. It was swift, mercifully professional, the end carried out precisely as intended. Samuel, Elijah, and Noah Hartley left this world as they had entered it, together. The crowd remained silent, the air thick with the weight of finality. There were no cheers, no outbursts, only quiet acceptance. Elizabeth Pierce closed her eyes and whispered what might have been a prayer or a farewell to Jonathan. Around her, other victims' families embraced through tears, the long nightmare at last brought to a close. The bodies were left suspended for the legally required time, a somber declaration that justice had been done, before being cut down and released to Josiah Hartley, who had appeared quietly at the edge of the gathering. Without a word, he took his sons back to their mountain home, burying them in 3 unmarked graves deep within the forest. The exact resting place was never revealed, and Josiah carried that secret to his own grave 5 years later. In the months and years that followed, life in the Appalachians slowly began to heal. Travelers once again dared to take the old trails, though many still preferred the longer, safer routes. Tales of the Hartley Triplets evolved into legend, whispered in taverns and around campfires, each retelling adding new embellishments until truth and myth became inseparable. The Hartley homestead was eventually abandoned. Rebecca lived there for several years after Josiah's death, but grief and isolation finally drove her away. She left to live with her sister in another state and never returned. The house and its outbuildings decayed with time, swallowed by weeds and rot, until only fragments of their foundations remained. The cave was sealed by county officials, packed with stones and earth, so that its horrors could never again see light. Yet the impact of the case endured. The trial established critical precedents for the region, proving that even in the most remote mountains, the reach of the law was absolute. Sheriff Garrett used the widespread attention to strengthen his department, securing new funding for patrols and safety measures along rural roads. The presence of regular lawmen on the trails helped prevent others from following in the triplets' footsteps. The victims' families found their own paths toward healing. Elizabeth Pierce never remarried. Instead, she dedicated her remaining years to charitable work, helping widows and the families of missing travelers. She founded a small memorial fund in Jonathan's name, which went toward improving mountain safety and supporting search and rescue efforts. Others, too, learned to live with their scars, finding ways to continue despite the losses that could never fully fade. The case files of the Hartley trial were carefully preserved in the county courthouse, becoming among the most studied criminal records in West Virginia's history. Historians, legal scholars, and writers came for decades afterward, all seeking to understand how 3 brothers from an ordinary family had descended into such monstrous cruelty. None ever found a complete answer, because some darkness in human nature cannot be fully explained. Now, more than 150 years later, the Appalachian Mountains still stand vast and mysterious. The trails where the Hartleys once stalked their prey have become paved roads and popular hiking paths. Technology and community have made the region far safer. But the past lingers. On foggy nights, when mist curls through the valleys, old-timers still tell stories of the 3 brothers who turned the wilderness into their hunting ground. The legacy of the Hartley Triplets is not one of supernatural evil, but of choice, of what happens when people surrender empathy to greed and cruelty. Samuel, Elijah, and Noah were not born monsters. They became them by will. Justice eventually caught up to them, but the cost, measured in lives lost and families destroyed, remains a haunting reminder of what humanity is capable of. Even today, the mountains keep their secrets. Hikers sometimes stumble upon strange remnants, a rusted buckle, wagon fragments, or bones too old to identify. No one knows how many of the 43 marks on the cave wall truly represented a life taken, or how many victims still lie hidden beneath the roots of ancient trees. The Appalachian Mountains may wish to forget, but history refuses. This chapter endures as a chilling lesson in both human darkness and human justice, a warning that echoes through the valleys for all who listen. If this journey through the shadows of history moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more forgotten stories that deserve to be remembered. Share your thoughts on this case and tell us where you're watching from. Each subscription helps keep these lost narratives alive.